If you had asked any stranger standing under our half-tented marquee on that day why the circus arrived in their town, they would have told you, with the kind of certainty usually reserved for recipes and accusations, that we came because the sky was crying. They would have been right, but not in the way they'd think. We did come because the sky decided it wanted an audience. We came because rain makes people willing to believe in improbable things. But the deeper reason, the one that makes us set up only where gutters gossip and awnings often drip, is that rain gives us the license to be small and absurd and still somehow important. Sadness and silliness sit differently under a wet roof. They share heat from the same lamp. It is easier, when you are damp, to admit to being human. Etus van was a study in order, pretending to be misfit. From the outside it looked like any other carriage we towed behind, an assemblage of patched wagons, a wooden box on wheels, a brass nameplate slightly askew, a chimney that never smoked on false pride. Inside, however, it had been arranged as if a librarian had decided to take up fortune-telling. Shelves had been built for notebooks. Pockets were sewn into the walls. There were small drawers labeled in a handwriting that loved commerce. There were, in other words, more lists than one might reasonably expect from a soothsayer. Lists, she believed, were a kind of kindness, gives sorrow a slot and it stops crowding the room. I knocked once because theatrics are a good habit. The rattle of a knock in wet wood sounds like a metronome to the dramatic. Etta answered with spectacles already fogged by the weather, by the world, and by whatever she had been thinking. She wore a coat that had the irresistible charm of mismatched thrift, each patch a different memory, and her hair had chosen to be sympathetic to the clouds. "Come in and track the rain on my rugs," she said, wiping at her glasses with a hand that smelled faintly of lemon and lint. "Sit. You're dripping the way people guilt-trip puddles. Merrin, they apologize for being wet, and puddles forgive them without comment. It is a cheap trick to be made warm by a friend's practical cruelty. I took the offer because cold makes metaphors literal in me." My patched knees left little surprised circles on her floor. She had lit a lamp that did not look like a lamp in any catalogue. It was a teapot with a bulb inside, and the light it shed smelled like old paper. On her small table lay an army of notebooks. They were of all sizes, some the width of a thumb, some fat with staples, some stitched in thread that had known other pockets. Papers fluttered as rain fretted at the window. Tickets, receipts, and a folded page of a children's drawing peeked from the margins like shy witnesses. "You have a whole library in here," I said, because it felt like the correct amount of astonishment. "It's poor cataloguing," she answered, "but it is tidy in ways that matter." She pushed the nearest book toward me. The spine cracked like a polite complaint. "These are storms. These are names of people who apologized to puddles on particular dates. These are consolations I've tucked into pockets and later found like lint." And here she tapped a page with a soft nail. "Here are municipal notes." She opened to a sheet where a clerk had, in a neat, bureaucratic hand, written something like Festival Restrictions 1924 Amendment, Clause 2B, and then, in a more hurried hand, C, Subtext of Grief. The words were not meant for performance. They were there to be obeyed. "They file things away," Etta said. She did not mean file in the cheek-in-pocket way of my profession. She meant it like a machine files, folds memory into a box, locks the lid, makes a silence. They issue stamps. Little red stamps that mean you are not allowed to gather. They Photoshop joy out of the town record. People still gather, of course. They just become ghosts in their own celebrations. Reading the notes felt like listening to a faint wind that might be a smile if you cupped your ears. The clerk had justified the ordinance in language that smelled like accountants and old bread. For the preservation of civic tranquility and prevention of extraneous revelry in dry months, public festivals are hereby limited. There was a second line, almost a whisper beneath the formal text, a marginalia that curved like a question mark, where laughter might be conflated with derision. The notion that towns might legislate merriment sounded ridiculous until you saw the neatness of the clause, and the way it could be enforced by a sufficiently somber official with a stamp. It is deceptively easy to convert one offended heart into a municipal habit. A person complains loudly, and maybe with good reason, and someone else, wanting order, makes a rule. Repeat. Repeat often enough, and rules start to feel like nature. Do you think they can make laughter illegal? I asked, the question more theatrical than philosophical. It was a child's worry, but also the exact sort of thing that will keep a man awake when his job depends upon the thing in question. Etta spectacles fogged as she breathed. No, not in the way you mean. There is no law that will make lungs stop. But they can make gatherings untenable. They can make the places where laughter grows hide themselves. They can make the first person to laugh uneasy. They can tell people, repeatedly, that what they feel is wrong. She had what economists call a no-nonsense look when she said it, a look that treated sentiment like another item on an inventory. It was never about preventing people from being amused. It was about policing what counts as public solace. What you do in private that can be messy. But when people start to be comforted publicly, that's where officials get nervous. Because consolation changes a population in ways numbers don't like. I thought of my barrel of guffaws, the hollow ribcage that followed each show. The way applause always sounded like a deposit being made into a bank that I could not access. It felt, in that small van with its teapot lamp, like the right metaphor for why my laugh had been stolen from me. Not taken by a witch or a demon alone, but negotiated away in bureaucratic footnotes and offended hearts. Tell me the story you tell, Etta, I said. The one you tell without shorthand. She hesitated. There are, in her profession, many stories she could tell in tight, economical versions, little fictions that give the listener the appropriate shiver. But she had a ledger in which she kept a sort of inventory of omissions, names she had meant to visit and had not, letters she had filed under later and then misplaced. Her voice when she told the story held the sound of a person who had started telling it to herself to keep the edges even. There was once, she began, a patron of the arts who loved being seen as a man of fine taste. He adored small, private amusements, a witty dinner here, a resigned chuckle at the right moment. He could be generous. He could also be terribly proud. He sat once in the back of a small theater while a performer bright, maybe too bright, laughed at something the patron had said in private. Not a terrible thing perhaps, but it cut him in the wrong way. He felt exposed, humiliated in the way only the well-scrutinized can feel. And instead of saying so, perhaps he asked a clerk to note it. Maybe he asked the town to keep good order. And the clerk, in an office that liked rules the way a moth likes cloth, turned it over into a clause. Protect the sensibilities of the patron, they wrote. Prevent gatherings that might lead to such embarrassment. It sounded almost plausible. It sounded like a story that could be true, because true stories are often made of embarrassment and stamps. So your curse, I said, because the straightness of asking questions is a habit of ours, one of the few useful things clowns ever carry from childhood isn't just a curse. It's a policy-adjacent thing. She smiled like a person who had been keeping an unpaid bill in her pocket for longer than she liked. Don't make lawyers of our metaphors. But yes, a misapplied laugh was noticed, taken as a harm, and then repeated until the harm seemed like sense. People told the story enough, and a machine and institution took hold of it and began to tidy. Institutions are allergic to nuance. They prefer rectangles. She tapped another page. And once a thing is recorded in a ledger, it changes where people will stand in a park. It changes their willingness to share breath openly. Outside, the Vanabusker played an accordion with such optimism it seemed almost cruel. The notes shook the raindrops on the window as if testing whether they would remain droplets or dissolve into the air. The sound made me think of those public decisions, small initial irritations that become big consequences, and of how, in our business, You rely upon the public's willingness to risk being wrong about their feelings for a moment. You need people to forget their dignity to laugh at the wrong second. You need people to be careless with themselves. Etta leafed through more pages. There were lists of Storm's March, sulky fidgets at dusk. April, clean laugh, like coins in the rain, and next to many of them, neat columns titled Obstruction, with notes like Clerk Intervention, Festival stamped 1937, or Mayor's Memo, Discourage Gatherings near Reservoir. She had marked certain entries in crimson thread, as if sewing up small wounds on the records. This may not be the whole story, she admitted. It is never the whole story. But the pattern is there. The patron's pride was the seed. The clerk's neatness was the soil. The rest was repetition. And remember, things rise into law because people complain, and someone finds it easier to make a rule than to reconcile. I thought then of the nights we performed for farmers who went home with a small, private light in their pockets, and of August, who counted applause with that small brass counter of his as though, if he miscounted, we would float. I thought of Nell, who would fly across the tent and pull the world taut with her limbs. All of us, in our own small ways, propped holes in people's days with ridiculousness. To have the architecture of that kindness slowly misfiled into unkindness felt like watching a familiar garment list, it seems. So what do we do? I asked. The question was enormous by accident. It always is when you try to wrap policy, weather, and humiliation into a single box. Etta folded a page with the calm of someone who has folded many things and learned that creases make truths more legible. We do not argue with ledgers with flowers, she said. We produce witnesses. We gather evidence that joy cannot be easily boxed. We must show in ways that cannot be stamped out that people will still gather, and that those gatherings have meaning beyond a clerk's discomfort. Can you do that? I asked. Can you read the rain with enough evidence? She glanced at me as one might glance at a man holding an umbrella indoors, amused but not surprised. I can try. And in the meanwhile, perhaps you should go to the Rain archives. There is a woman who files thunder-like receipts. She may have the missing fragment. She'll be somber and have a cat the color of ledger paper. She might tell you a version that sounds far nastier than what I give you, because archives have a taste for neatness and blame. The prospect pleased me and terrified me in equal measure. I have, in the past, been more comfortable repairing costumes than facing what might be true about myself. But we are a troupe that functions on small acts of bravery. We put up a tent even when the tent wants to unravel. We step onto narrow planks and pretend the ground will wait politely for our return. I finished my tea in a single theatrical motion and put on my coat that smelled faintly of grease paint and old applause. Before I left, Etta pressed one of the slimmer notebooks into my hands. It felt like being given a small, damp map. Take this, she said. If you are going to be poking at archives and asking unpleasant questions, at least have something to show that you are not a wandering fable. The list near the back, those are apologies to puddles. People write them when they are ashamed and then feel better because the puddle cannot be offended. Sometimes, if you offer a puddle a true apology, it will teach you the difference between an honest laugh and one that is contemptuous. I put the book in my pocket and felt the weight of a dozen small confessions press into my thigh. Outside, the rain tapped a rhythm on the van's roof as if keeping time for a song I could not yet hear. I stepped back into the wet air and walked across the yard where the tents folded like tired paper. There was a smell of mud and cotton, and the particular scent of a canvas that had seen better audiences. Nell's laughter came down from the tightrope brief incandescent. August's brass counter clicked, somewhere like a heartbeat. Marigold, moving without sound, arranged our supper like a conjurer laying out hidden cards. The notebook in my pocket was not a solution. It was, at best, a clue, and at worst, a document might make the whole enterprise of trying to prove a thing feel more like work than art. But Etta's lists had done something to me. They had turned my vague resentment into a map. They had given the shape of a system to the abstract theft of my laugh. That alone was a kind of gift, because knowing where to go is the first small ritual of rebellion. The rain leaned harder. In my throat something tight unwound. I had the feeling, then, of a man who had been given a library card and told the stacks were open at midnight. There was a chest of thin, bureaucratic truths somewhere in the next town, and I had to find it. I walked toward the road, my coat catching the droplets like punctuation. As I left, Etta called after me in a voice that was both practical and oddly affectionate. "Don't take anything from a child without a promise in return, Merrin. Thieves are clever in well-meaning hands." I laughed, a small noise that was not what the policy had taken from me, and therefore did not count, and answered, because it felt good to speak back across the wet yard. "I will barter with promises. I have a pocket watch that keeps old jokes. I think it might be a poor banker, but a faithful one." She watched me go, spectacles catching the light like two small moons. The lamp in her van made a puddle of light on the ground. For a moment, it looked as if a small, private ritual had happened inside the van, one woman unwrapping the way the world files its joys, and another man being given a list with which to go and argue. I stepped off into the street and let the rain smooth the edges of my resolve. The rain archives would be quieter than the van. Archives prefer the sound of ink to the sound of applause. There would be dust and cats, and the smell of thunder catalogue like a spice. There would, if Etta was right, be a sentence somewhere that began a chain. My next stop was not a stage. It was a room of records. If one embarrassed heart could convert joy into law, perhaps one careful looking could convert law back into a story. I clipped my pocket watch closed and felt, for the first time in a long while, that the watch's jokes might be more useful than their time. The road was a river of reflected lamps. I walked, thinking of apologies to puddles and of how small, bureaucratic habits become architecture. Somewhere ahead, in a place where the rain was not only falling but filing itself with purpose, a woman would be waiting with thunder on a ledger. I had questions. I had a notebook. And more importantly, I had a map of how to begin. I learned early that the wire does not ask for courage so much as it asks for honesty. It is not the bravado of stepping out into nothing. It is the arithmetic of trust, one stubborn length of steel, two hands, and 1,000 tiny agreements secreted into breath and stance. When Nell Highwire Fenn walked the line that morning, she did not stride. She negotiated. She moved like someone counting stitches in a hem that will not hold unless every stitch admits it might let go. You would have thought, from the way our audience applauds the aerial bit, that the wire is the high drama of our trade. They clap for the fall avoided, the swing named and then tamed. What they do not always see is the long rehearsal that turns danger into a domesticity, how we teach one another to extend hands and take weight. That is what Nell taught the trainees, not a technique of show, but a grammar of catching. "Your hands," she said, with all the kindly impatience of someone who has caught 1,000 unready falls. "They are not applause. They are shelters. Do not curl your fingers like someone hiding a secret. Open them like you are holding a small, sleeping animal. Your palm is a ferry. Your thumb is a gate. Keep your gate polite but available." She said it like an accountant counting tender liabilities. The wire shivered under her boots. Rain beaded on the rope and formed tiny, stubborn pearls that slid as she passed, resetting the world as if punctuation had been applied mid-sentence. The town beyond the practice rig was muffled, a watercolor of chimneys and awnings. The circus exists where skies allow it, always in a state of being readied for performance, but this morning was only rehearsal for life. I leaned against a post with my pockets full of habits. My paint was still moist in places where a hurried hand had smudged it while we packed. My pocket watch ticking jokes the way some people have hearts that tick time. I was supposed to be overseeing the younger clown's timing, marking when a pratfall should be gentle and when it should be theatrical. It is a job I do well, counting guffaws, and indexing the little turns that coaxed them out, but the wire lesson had a different gravity. It asked me to catalogue not smiles but their conditions. So I catalogue. I have a way of doing it, not the neat, clinical way of a scholar, but a botanist's hands on delicate leaves. I press each smile between the pages in my head, and if it is peculiar enough, I remember the exact angle of mouth and the way the cheeks folded. Old habits are small preservations of joy. Nell's voice braided through those observations. "Merrin," she said, when at last she came down and set her boots on the sawdust like two deliberate decisions, "counting will not teach them to fall. Neither will polishing boots. You can measure a laugh until the numbers are thin as glass, but you cannot measure the way hands arrive when someone needs them. Neither can you measure the way a laugh leaves you empty," I said, perhaps more sharply than courtesy required. Her boots made the kind of sound an oak makes when it considers a branch. She looked at me with a face that had learned to balance both daring and due care. "What you cannot take for yourself," she said, "you can still learn to share in taking. It is easy to baptize such sentences as metaphors when you hear them. It is harder to know how to practice them." Nell began the lesson with smallness. She taught the trainees to step onto a low line, to wobble exquisitely until their feet remembered the necessary positions. She would not accept bravado. A boy who had once insisted he feared nothing had to admit out loud that he was frightened of the sound his own boots made on the rope. Saying the fear allowed the rope to know it could be borne. We work with a language of risk. On the wire the vocabulary is literal, lean, counterweight, recover. Off it, the terms are quieter and more diplomatic, listening, waiting, offering. Marigold, who rarely spoke with words, kept visiting with gestures that translated these terms into dinner-time domesticity. She would set an invisible table between two performers after practice and mime the passing of a plate, the cutting of bread. It is a small theater for an even smaller audience, we who know the cost of a night watched. She set the table that day with the kind of solemnity reserved for prayer. I watched as her fingers, painted white, coaxed the air into the shapes of bowls and spoons. The scent of frying onions that seemed to accompany the mime was not in the air. No frying pan had been lit, but we inhaled it anyway, because the room had been starved for ordinary domestic rituals, and our lungs were hungry. A knot of trainees gathered, eyes slack with the relief of being permitted to eat when nothing was cooking. They took invisible bites and pretended to chew, as if chewing itself could make a celebration out of scarcity. There is a precise cruelty in theatrical training. You teach people to wear their fear so that the audience will not have to. But there is also a patient kindness. If you are careful enough, the training becomes a catalogue of ways to be helped. When Nell demonstrated the catch, she made it slow and deliberate. A trainee would fall intentionally, and instead of demonstrating a heroic single-handed rescue, Nell would show how the responsibility passes through 3 hands, perhaps 4. The first would not be the only rescuer. The third hand, unimportant on its own, matters because it is the confirmation, the final softening that says, "I was here with you." We practice that with mechanics as well as language. Nell had taught us a particular protocol for falling: make yourself small enough to receive help. Pick a focal point so that you do not lose each other in the panic. Do not snap your knees like someone cracking brittle wood. The first time a trainee actually slipped during a rehearsal, it was a small, shapely disaster. For a moment everything became noise, the wind, the rope, a metal ring tinny with the wet. Then Nell's hands closed around the student's wrist like 2 pages of a book closing quick. We did not cheer. We breathed in unison and exhaled like a single relieved bell. I suppose I had expected a different consequence from watching all of this. I am a clown trained to draw laughter from the raw. My trade demands a kind of extraction and return. I take an odd sound from the world, knead it into a joke, and put it back different. Yet here, in the hush following a practiced fall, I felt the edges of my profession blur. The thing I had thought of as my product, laughter, was not a currency to hoard. It was the sign of an economy. It marked exchanges of holding and being held. This recognition does not come cleanly. It trickled in like the day itself through small admissions and private experiments. After practice, I went to the edge of the rigging, where a collapsed awning propped up by a stack of spare ropes formed a sort of alcove, and I sat with my pocket watch on my knee. The watch does not tell the hour, it tells me jokes, or at least where my jokes were and who they landed on. Today its tiny hands pointed not to previous punchlines, but to fissures in my painted smile. I took my makeup off a finger at a time because there is a ritual in dirt that I like, to see how something used to be pretty becomes honest. When I looked at my reflection in the puddle the rain had left, the painted grin looked very small, like the map of a town reduced to postage size. The lines around my mouth seemed to be not drawing laughter but recording weather. I counted them because that is what I do. One sample, corner of mouth lifts slightly for recognition rather than amusement. 2. Nasolabial fold deepens when a message is sympathy, not surprise. 3. A tiny break at the right eyebrow that indicates pure amusement cannot pass because someone shut the gate when it reached them. There is a distinct shame in cataloging your own deficits. It feels like confessing to a crime you do not fully understand. I am not ashamed because I failed to laugh. I am ashamed because I am such a competent manufacturer of laughter for others. How do you sit down with an audience that trusts you to deliver mirth and tell them the delivery room is empty? Nell sat down beside me without asking. "You look as if someone has borrowed your map and not returned it," she said simply. She had the practical, wry air of someone who keeps a toolkit of metaphors and chooses them with thrift. Maps are communal. Nobody owns a map of a town that wants people in it. "Do you ever feel," I muttered, which is the polite voice I use when saying something dangerous, "that falling would be easier if we all agreed to drop at once? That then we'd all know how to pick one another up?" She blinked, as if considering the mathematics of that proposition. "That would be a parade of broken spines. We do not need synchrony. We need readiness. You can teach them to catch without teaching them to fall in a spectacle. That is the trick. The show must not be the instruction. Keep the training quiet. Teach the code in the off hours. It is an awkward thing to be taught to be held. Most teaching in our profession is the opposite. We are trained to be seen without giving away the scaffolding. The high-wire lesson was an exception. It was pedagogy disguised as circus school. It asked us to make our weaknesses legible. After the young ones left each with a clumsy new certainty in their step and fingers that trembled with the aftershocks of adrenaline, we repaired to the small, domestic stage Marigold had invented behind the canvas. She cleared nothing and set the table with an attention that seemed to declare, "The small things are sacred when the big ones are under threat." She pantomimed with an exactitude that forced us into assent. We ate and were made warm as if the ritual had conjured a stove. There is a genuine economy to these rituals. We make small consolations for one another because we do not yet have the resources for larger rescues. Etta counts our savings and decides how many weeks of borrowed rain we can afford. August talks about mortgages of applause and how a borrowed ovation is still debt. Gus white-knuckles his inventions and keeps promising the device that will measure whether a laugh is authentic or not. These are the forms of care our troop can offer: sheets patched at dawn, coins palm-sized and trembling, a machine that will not quite tell you whether it was a true laugh, but will tell you that a sound met the right acoustic pitch. I had a modest, almost ridiculous experiment of my own that evening. If Nell's lesson suggested that the mechanics of catching mattered, perhaps the mechanics of falling could be practiced too. Not the trapeze of melodrama, no ground stage collapse for audience reward, but a small, private risk. I walked down to the edge of the tent where we stored the props, a trunk of clown shoes, a stack of scarves, a wooden dummy with a painted smile. I found a cushion, placed it with exaggerated sloppiness on a pile of blankets, and prepared to fall where someone might find me. The problem with dramatizing vulnerability is that you can easily turn it into performance. I had to be careful. Marigold appeared, not because I called for her, but because she reads the room. Her face is a map of silence. I have often suspected she keeps speech in a jar like preserves. She sat opposite me and mimed the ritual of listening, head inclined, hand to ear, as if to say, "I am present. I will keep the sound safe." Her ears, painted white, shone. I lay down and let the cushion receive me. I could have chosen something more dramatic. A fall on stage is a good punchline. This was not for the crowd. This was to practice being small. I closed my eyes and let the old showman reflexes go. For a few seconds, my brain catalogued the shapes of shame, what we were all hoarding. The names of the jokes I had told at the wrong time, and then something happened that I had not quite expected. Someone's hand, probably Nell's, slid under my back and held me steady. It was not theatrical. There was no applause to warrant the motion. It was rather the quiet arithmetic of presence. She did not say, "See," or "Well done," she simply stayed. Marigold continued to mime bread and butter, and a trainee placed a clean scarf over my knees, as if I were a patient of small injuries. For a moment I imagined how odd it would appear to a spectator, Merindrol, the clown who can make a church laugh, practicing how to be held like a child. I laughed at the image, and it was a thin, startled thing that could have been mistaken for a replacement for the laugh I could not take. Nell felt it and, with the sort of precision a surgeon reserves for the well-timed stitch, squeezed my shoulder. "That is how you start," she said. "Little catches. Little permissions. It is not about making a grand plea. It is about aligning your breathing with someone else's. The rest is practice." That night I slept poorly, but with less ache than usual. Someone had removed the sting from the bottom of my chest for a little while. I had not recovered my laugh. The curse was still a dry place in me. But the lesson of the wire had shown me a rote. If I could learn to fall deliberately, if I could practice the small humiliations under the gaze of friends, I might also learn the grammar of being offered back a laugh, not as a spoonful returned from the cupboard, but as a thing that arrives when others know to catch you. We rehearse spectacle to be seen. We rehearse care in secret to be sustained. The two are not mutually exclusive, but they often speak different languages. Nell's class was a translation manual. As I left the rigging, the town receded into a watercolor blur of damp windows. The wire glinted like a stray sentence that managed to make sense. I walked beneath it and felt, absurdly, as if I were passing under a spine. The troupe was winding down, each of us folding our private economies into whatever little pockets we had left. Marigold packed invisible plates into a real cloth bag with an expression that seemed to say, "Hold on to this. Do not let the small things be eaten by the big ones." Before I turned in, I pulled my pocket watch from the inner fold of my coat. The watch has an odd custom. When I am near laughter I cannot have, it ticks like a clock measuring absence. Tonight it ticked differently. It clicked with the soft, irregular rhythm of a hand being offered and accepted. I opened it and, instead of the usual punchline phrases etched on its tiny brass face, I found one line I had not noticed before. To be caught is not to be broken. It may be a trick of sentiment to let a watch carry meaning. But in our business, a trick is often the only currency, and we circulate meaning the way a post office circulates letters. I put the watch back and folded the day into the small trunk of memory I keep for rainy nights. The next morning would bring its own requisitions: a market town to charm, a seam to check, an audience who would like to forget whatever soaked them that week. But for the first time in a while I had a practicable exercise for my vow. Find my laugh before the last seam comes undone. Step 1. Practice falling in a place where hands know how to arrive. The tent flap snapped in the wind like a hand closing a book. I looked at Nell one last time as she balanced on a crate, fingering a length of spare rope. as if it were a thought she wanted to keep from unraveling. She caught my eye, and in that glance something like agreement passed between us. I did not know yet whether learning to be caught would return my laugh or merely make me less lonely on stage. But the thought of being less lonely was itself a small mercy. I walked away with my pockets full of catalogued smiles, my head busy with diagrams of hands and thresholds, and a watch that told me to expect being held. Outside, the rain continued to decide where we might set our stakes. Inside me, a different weather moved a small, temperate change toward the possibility of risk that could be survived. It is a curious thing to trade the bravura of performance for the modesty of repair, to prefer ceremony over spectacle, and to find that the most heroic act in a circus may be to stand still and allow someone else to take a portion of your weight. When next we take the stage, I thought as the canvas flapped and settled, perhaps I will practice the smallness I have learned. Perhaps I will let a laugh be something that travels rather than something I monopolize. For now, the lesson is unfinished, and the wire waits. The next town is not far. The rain that carries us there has its own ledger. I had a notion then faint, as if scribbled on the back of a ticket, that learning how to fall might be the first step to learning how to laugh. And so, with a pocket watch that whispered new commandments and the echo of Marigold's silent supper ringing in my ears, I folded myself into the night, wondering what would happen when we all agreed to be a little more breakable. The answer I suspected would arrive like the audience's applause, unexpected, communal, and sometimes, if we were very lucky, true. We did not know it yet, but the wire lesson had planted a seed. The towns ahead would demand performances. The auditor's ledger would continue to rustle by way of caution. But for the first time in a long while I felt that the path to reclaiming my laugh did not lead toward theatrics alone. It led toward the order of small practiced intimacies. I would get up on stage again. I would tell jokes. But between the pratfalls I would train my hands and those of my troupe to be better at the quiet arithmetic of catching. If laughter is a thing that can be given and returned, then perhaps the way to reclaim mine was not to take but to teach others how to keep it safe. The next morning, if the rain held, we would rehearse again. If it did not, then we would mend and eat what we had. Either way, the lesson of the wire would have its afterlife, and somewhere in the coming days, I would have to try the same act in a different register. Not a student falling into trusting hands, but an audience given permission to fall into tenderness. That, I thought as I closed my eyes, would be a very good place to begin.